The Galactic Council chamber was a grandiose, circular room floating high above the capital world of Sci-Fi 9. Its massive crystal ceiling allowed an unobstructed view of the stars, a serene contrast to the absolute chaos unfolding below it. Catastrophic losses, an Urdak general roared, his mandibles clicking in frustration. The Skaar have crushed 3 more of our fleets. If this continues, we will be discussing the terms of our surrender within the month. A chorus of agitated voices filled the chamber. Dozens of alien representatives bickering, their various appendages flailing in outrage. A Lumari delegate, an amphibious being with bioluminescent tendrils, let out a distressed trill. Our war projections predicted victory within 6 months. How could our advanced strategies fail so completely? Their forces adapt too quickly, grumbled a reptilian Vortari. They counter every formation, exploit every flaw. Even our most advanced AI simulations cannot keep up. The air thickened with frustration and fear. The Skaar Dominion, a race of ruthless, war-driven conquerors, had thrown the most powerful coalition in the galaxy into disarray. The Galactic Council had technology, resources, and a strategic network spanning thousands of systems. Yet none of it mattered. The Skaar were winning. Then the human representative spoke. "We can help." Silence fell over the chamber. All eyes, compound, bioluminescent, multi-lidded, turned toward the lone human in the room. Ambassador Richard Hayes adjusted his navy blue suit, looking entirely too comfortable for someone facing a room full of panicked aliens. Earth has a, shall we say, long history of warfare. Millennia of experience. We'd be happy to provide assistance. Laughter erupted from various council members. The Urdak general slapped one of his massive claws against the table, his species equivalent of an amused snort. Humans? No offense, Hayes, but your people are primitive. Your ships are smaller. Your weapons lack the refinement of our plasma accelerators or quantum disruptors. What could you possibly offer? Hayes smirked. Victory. That single word had the weight of a black hole. The council chamber went silent again, but this time, it was the silence of consideration. The desperation in the room was palpable. A Lumari delegate leaned forward, bioluminescent spots flickering in uncertainty. And what, exactly, would this victory entail? You cannot expect us to believe that human troops could succeed where our finest warriors have failed. The ambassador folded his hands together. We don't fight wars like you do. No offense, but from what I've read, most of your strategies rely on predictive modeling, AI-assisted logistics, and cold, calculated battlefield formations. The Skaar are outplaying you because they know exactly how you'll respond before you do. The Vortari general hissed in frustration. That is how war is fought. That is the pinnacle of modern strategy. Hayes shrugged. Yeah, while humans fight dirty, the silence stretched longer this time. Some members of the council shifted uncomfortably. Others simply stared, as if expecting him to elaborate. Before they could press him further, the chamber doors slid open with a soft hiss. A dozen figures entered the room, moving with a sense of calm authority that set them apart from the usual military representatives. They weren't what the council expected. No gleaming power armor. No genetically enhanced super soldiers. No elite, battle-hardened youth trained in the latest combat simulations. Instead, they got old men and women. The leader of the group, a grizzled man with silver hair and deep-set eyes, walked with an air of quiet confidence. His uniform, though impeccably pressed, had the unmistakable look of someone who had seen more wars than the entire council combined. His name tag read General Marcus Hayes. A Lutheri representative blinked its 3 sets of eyes. Ambassador Hayes, is this some kind of joke? The ambassador grinned. Nope. This is Earth's finest. The general stopped in front of the council table, surveying the assembled aliens with a look that suggested he had been in more life-or-death meetings than he cared to count. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted dignitaries, he said, voice gravelly with age and experience. Let's get one thing straight. You're losing this war because you're trying to outthink the enemy. We're here to outfight them. The Urdak general narrowed his yellow eyes. You're all old. One of the human veterans, An older woman with a deep scar running down her cheek crossed her arms. You say that like it's a bad thing. A chuckle rippled through the human soldiers. The aliens, however, looked unconvinced. Ambassador Hayes leaned forward, resting his elbows on the council table. Let me explain something. These men and women, they've fought in wars before your civilizations even knew what a war was. They've been in trenches. They've led ambushes. They've survived against enemies who had better weapons, better numbers, and better technology. And you know what? They still won. The general nodded. Because we don't rely on machines to do our thinking for us. We rely on instinct, on experience, on knowing how to turn a bad situation into a worse one for the enemy. And trust me, there is no enemy in the galaxy that has seen what we have. The Lamari delegates' bioluminescent tendrils flickered in a pattern that roughly translated to skeptical curiosity. What exactly do you propose? Hayes gestured toward the group. Drop them into a contested war zone. Give them full operational control. If they fail, we'll pack up and leave, no questions asked. But if they succeed, he let that hang in the air, allowing the council members to fill in the blanks themselves. A murmur passed through the chamber. The proposal was outrageous, insulting even, and yet the war was already lost. After a long, tense pause, the Urdak general exhaled through his mandibles. Fine. One battlefield. One chance. His gaze swept over the humans, lingering on their weathered faces, the scars of old battles etched into their skin. Let's see if your ancient warriors can truly turn the tide. General Hayes smirked. You're going to regret saying that. The battlefield of Vorthas 7 was a wasteland of shattered metal and burning skies. Skaar war machines, towering behemoths of reinforced chitin and plasma cannons, prowled the ruins, crushing whatever remained of the last failed counteroffensive. The Galactic Council's forces had been retreating for weeks, and by now, the enemy was so confident in their victory that they barely considered the incoming human deployment a threat. That was their first mistake. General Marcus Hayes stood at the top of a ridgeline, his old joints protesting the climb, watching his ragtag group of veterans set up their positions. They worked with the efficiency of people who had done this before, because they had many times in wars that had long since faded from history. Behind him, Lieutenant Colburn, a man with more gray in his beard than patience in his soul, squinted through a pair of old-fashioned binoculars. You know, sir, I don't think they're taking us seriously. Good, Hayes replied, lighting a cigar with the casualness of a man who had once survived an enemy bombardment by falling into a ditch at just the right time. That makes them predictable. Down in the valley, the Skaar formations were arranged with mechanical precision. They had studied the way the council fought, calculated, orderly, by-the-book engagements. They assumed the humans would fight the same way. That was their second mistake. Sergeant Mendoza, a woman who had single-handedly taken out a mechanized platoon in the Jovian insurgency with nothing but a stolen grenade and bad intentions, checked the makeshift explosives she had planted along the only viable approach to the ridge. Permission to start making their day worse, sir? Hayes exhaled a plume of smoke and smiled. By all means. The first explosion sent a ripple of confusion through the Skaar ranks. Their AI-assisted targeting systems calculated the blast pattern, instantly identifying a weakness in the ridge's defenses. They adjusted formations accordingly, sending in a spearhead of heavy infantry. That was their third mistake. The old soldiers didn't fight fair. Instead of engaging in a direct firefight, they vanished into the rubble, moving like ghosts through the wreckage of old battles. They set traps, improvised explosives, tripwires, even simple pitfalls covered with debris. Some of the veterans, like old Sergeant Kowalski, took great pleasure in leaving misleading footprints in the dust, leading Skaar troops straight into ambush zones. Within minutes, what should have been a straightforward assault turned into a nightmare of confusion. Skaar warriors, bred for strength and speed, suddenly found themselves fighting against an enemy they couldn't predict. Their plasma weapons were powerful but slow to recharge. The humans knew this and struck during reload cycles. Their armor was thick but left gaps at the joints. The humans knew this and aimed accordingly. At one point, a Skaar squad corner Corporal Decker, a wiry man in his 60s with a permanent scowl. He dropped his rifle, raised his hands, and let them get close, just close enough to trigger the explosives he had wired to the nearby wreckage. The resulting explosion sent Skaar bodies flying, and Decker, dusting off his jacket, muttered, "Still got it." Above the battlefield, a council observation ship watched the fight unfold, broadcasting live footage back to the Galactic Council chamber. The same alien generals who had scoffed at the humans now watched in stunned silence as their greatest enemy faltered against an army of senior citizens. Ambassador Hayes leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "So, do we get an apology now? Or are we waiting until the war's over?" Back on Vorthas 7, the Skaar command unit, recognizing that their usual tactics weren't working, decided to deploy their war beasts, massive, tank-sized creatures covered in bioarmor and bristling with weaponry. The beasts thundered forward, shaking the ground with each step. Lieutenant Colburn eyed them through his binoculars and sighed. "All right, which one of you crazy bastards called them the big guys?" From a makeshift sniper nest, an old Scotsman named McGregor cracked his knuckles and grinned. Finally a challenge. He pulled a large, custom-built anti-material rifle onto his shoulder, took a slow breath, and fired. The round hit one of the beasts directly in its eye socket. It let out a screeching roar before toppling over, crushing several Skaar infantry beneath it. McGregor smirked. One down, the rest of the veterans adjusted accordingly. Instead of panicking, they got creative, using the terrain to slow the beast down, luring them into narrow alleys where their bulk became a disadvantage. Sergeant Mendoza rigged an old council hovercraft with explosives and sent it careening into a cluster of the creatures, detonating in a brilliant fireball. Even as the battle raged, Hayes noticed something. The Skaar were hesitating. They're afraid not of the humans' weapons, but of the fact that they couldn't understand them. Every time they adapted, the humans shifted tactics. Every time they thought they had control, the battlefield changed beneath their feet. That was when he knew they had already won. The final push came at dusk. The remaining Skaar forces, desperate and disorganized, attempted a full retreat. The old soldiers let them go, except for one unlucky squad that stumbled into a canyon where Corporal Decker had been waiting with a high-powered railgun. As the last Skaar transport vanished into the sky, Hayes looked around at his people, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, grinning like kids who had just pulled off the world's greatest prank. Lieutenant Colburn took a deep breath and wiped his forehead. "Well, sir, I think that went pretty well." Hayes nodded, exhaling the last of his cigar. "Yeah, not bad for a bunch of old-timers." Up in the council chambers, the alien generals stared at the battle report in stunned silence. The humans had not only won, but they had done so without a single casualty. The Vortari general, the same one who had mocked the humans earlier, let out a slow exhale. "I don't believe it." Ambassador Hayes smirked. "Believe it. And this was just a test run." Back on Vorthas 7, the old soldiers gathered around a makeshift campfire, sharing stories, passing around a flask of something that was probably illegal on half the council worlds. Sergeant Mendoza raised her cup. "To the Skaar, may they never figure out what the hell just happened." Laughter rippled through the group. They had just changed the course of the war, and they had done it their way. General Hayes leaned back, watching the stars. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since the war began, the Galactic Council had hope. And all it took was a group of stubborn old soldiers who refused to lose. The Galactic Council chamber had never been this quiet. Dozens of alien representatives sat in stunned silence, replaying the footage of the battle on Vorthas 7. The once invincible Skaar had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outright humiliated by a battalion of humans old enough to complain about their knees. Every military projection had been wrong. Every assumption about warfare had been shattered. Ambassador Richard Hayes was enjoying every second of it. He leaned back in his chair, casually sipping a cup of earth coffee, the strong kind that could strip paint off a starship hull. "Well, that was fun," he said, setting his mug down with a satisfied sigh. "So, when do we start planning the next one?" The Urdak general, who had previously dismissed humanity as primitive, now seemed to be reconsidering his entire worldview. He stared at the screen in disbelief, his mandibles twitching. This makes no sense. The Vortari war strategist, a being known for his ruthless tactical precision, simply exhaled. It is beyond logic. Hayes grinned. Exactly. You folks have been thinking about war. We just do it. Across the chamber, the Skaar ambassador, a towering brute of chitin and muscle, looked as if he had swallowed a live grenade. His species had never known true defeat. Now, he was watching his forces get outmaneuvered by men who complained about back pain. He leaned forward, his deep, guttural voice rumbling through the chamber. The Dominion underestimated you. Hayes smirked. Yeah, you did. On Vorthas 7, the human veterans were busy celebrating in the only way they knew how. By sitting around a makeshift campfire, passing around a bottle of something strong enough to qualify as spaceship fuel, and swapping war stories. Sergeant Mendoza was laughing so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. Did you see the look on that Skaar commander's face when Decker walked straight through their plasma fire like he was taking a Sunday stroll? Decker, who was gnawing on a piece of rations with all the enthusiasm of a man who had survived worse meals, shrugged. Armor's good. They aim bad. Not my problem. McGregor raised his flask. To the Skaar. May they never figure out what in the bloody hell just happened to them. A chorus of laughter and cheers followed. They had won, and they had done it their way. General Marcus Hayes sat slightly apart from the group, watching the stars. His knees ached. His back hurt. But for the first time in a long time, he felt alive. He had spent his entire career being told that war was changing, that drones, AI, and simulations were the future. That experience and instinct were obsolete. And yet here they were. A soft chime sounded from his communicator, a message from the council. He sighed and pushed himself to his feet, joints cracking in protest. Back in the council chamber, the discussion had shifted from disbelief to reluctant acceptance. The Urdak general exhaled through his mandibles. It seems we may have misjudged humanity. Hayes smirked. You don't say. The Lumari representative, whose species prided themselves on diplomacy over warfare, studied the reports with wide, glowing eyes. You did not simply win, you dismantled the Skaar's entire approach to combat. They will have to rethink their entire strategy. The Vortari strategist rubbed his temples. Which means we will have to rethink our strategy? The Skaar ambassador growled lowly, but it was not a sound of anger. It was something closer to respect. We do not acknowledge defeat easily. But this was a lesson. General Hayes, who had finally arrived at the chamber, stepped forward. He didn't salute. He didn't bow. He just planted his hands on the table and looked the Skaar straight in the eye. The lesson is simple. You rely too much on tech. You rely too much on predictability. But war isn't clean. It's messy. It's about who's willing to crawl through the dirt, who's willing to bleed, and who's willing to do the thing the other guy won't. The Skaar ambassador narrowed his eyes. And humans are? Hayes smiled. Every damn time. The chamber fell into silence once more. But this time, it wasn't disbelief. It was understanding. The Urdak general cleared his throat. We would like to discuss further integration of human forces into our war efforts. Hayes grinned. That's what I like to hear. Back on Vorthas 7, the veterans were still drinking, still laughing, still swapping stories. The war wasn't over. But for the first time since it began, the Galactic Council had hope. And all it had taken was a handful of stubborn old soldiers who refused to lose.